For 10 years, I believed I had everything. My wife, Emily, and I had built a life that anyone would envy. We lived in a beautiful home, the kind of house that whispered warmth and stability. It was the house where I imagined we'd raise our children, celebrate decades of anniversaries, and eventually grow old together. Emily and I met in college, and from the very beginning, she had this way of making me feel like the most important man in the world. She was vibrant, charming, and effortlessly beautiful, the kind of woman who could command a room without even trying. I had always considered myself lucky to have her. Our marriage was, by all appearances, a strong one. We had our ups and downs, just like any couple, but nothing that ever seemed irreparable. I worked as a financial analyst, spending long hours at the firm to provide for us, while Emily had taken on a more flexible career in interior design. She loved it, and I encouraged her to follow her passion. Despite our busy schedules, we made time for each other. Every Friday, we had date nights, even if it was just takeout and a movie. We traveled, we laughed, we planned for the future. From the outside looking in, we were the picture of a happy, successful marriage. But, as I would later learn, happiness can be an illusion. One carefully curated and controlled until the truth inevitably unravels it. Emily had always been close with my father, Richard. He was a man of influence, well respected in the business world, and someone I had spent my entire life looking up to. He and my mother divorced when I was still in high school, and since then, he had never remarried. Despite their separation, he was always present in my life, offering guidance, support, and, at times, tough love. Over the years, Emily and my father had built a friendly rapport. They joked around at family gatherings, exchanged texts about trivial matters, and occasionally met for lunch when I was busy with work. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was my father. She was my wife. They were two of the most important people in my life. I thought their closeness was just a testament to how well our family got along. Looking back now, I should have noticed the little things. The way Emily's phone screen always tilted away from me when she got a message, how her smile lingered a little too long when my father made a joke, the increasing number of times she started mentioning him in casual conversation. But hindsight is cruel that way. When you love someone, truly love them, you don't see the signs. Or maybe, you choose not to. The first cracks in our marriage appeared subtly. At first, it was just a feeling, an unshakable sense that something was off. Emily started becoming distant. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and easy intimacy, became mechanical, as though she was just going through the motions. Our Friday nights turned into her girls' nights out, and I found myself eating dinner alone more often than not. When I asked if something was wrong, she brushed me off, claiming stress from work or needing space to clear her mind. Then came the sex, or rather, the lack of it. What had once been an integral part of our marriage slowly faded into infrequent, half-hearted encounters. Whenever I initiated, she would claim exhaustion, a headache, or simply not being in the mood. At first, I believed her, but as the weeks turned into months, I began to wonder. Was it me? Had I become unattractive to her? Had I failed as a husband in some way? I tried everything to fix it. I planned surprise dates, booked a weekend getaway, even suggested couples therapy. But Emily always had an excuse. She became defensive, insisting that I was overreacting, that she just needed time. I wanted so badly to believe her. I convinced myself that all couples went through rough patches and that this was just ours. But the feeling never went away. It was a gnawing, unrelenting whisper in the back of my mind, telling me that something was wrong, telling me that my marriage, the life I had built with Emily, was starting to fall apart. I just didn't know yet how deep the betrayal ran. The feeling of unease lingered, growing heavier with each passing day. I tried to silence it, convincing myself that my concerns were baseless, but no matter how much I pushed it away, it always returned. Stronger, louder, more insistent. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it. Emily's behavior continued to change in ways I couldn't ignore. She became more secretive, her phone never leaving her side, even when she was just walking to another room. When I glanced at her screen, I would sometimes catch her swiftly closing an app, her fingers moving with practiced ease. It was subtle, but noticeable. She started wearing more perfume, dressing up for seemingly casual outings, and spending longer than usual getting ready. Then there were the unexplained absences. Nights out with friends that stretched until the early hours of the morning. Days where she claimed she was at work, but when I called her office, no one had seen her. She began taking showers the moment she got home, as if washing something away. I tried to confront her, gently at first. I told her I missed her, that I felt like we were drifting apart. She sighed, rolling her eyes, accusing me of being paranoid. "You're working too much," she said. "You're overthinking everything." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was imagining things. But I wasn't. I started paying closer attention, noting every inconsistency, every odd behavior. Emily had developed new habits, new routines, ones that I wasn't a part of. She started leaving for errands at odd hours, disappearing for long stretches of time without explanation. It wasn't just her. My father had been acting strangely, too. He had always been an authoritative presence in my life, a man who rarely let emotions dictate his decisions. But lately, he had been distant. He canceled our lunches, ignored my calls, and when we did speak, he seemed distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. I told myself that life was simply pulling us all in different directions. But that nagging feeling, that awful, suffocating sense that I was missing something, refused to go away. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Emily was getting ready to go out again. She claimed it was a last-minute dinner with friends, but something about her demeanor felt rehearsed. She had that nervous energy about her, the kind that people get when they're lying but trying too hard to seem natural. I waited until she left before I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked our home security system. We had cameras set up throughout the house for safety reasons, connected to an app on my phone. Emily didn't know I had the app. It was more of an afterthought to me, something I never really used. But that night, I decided to check. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the recordings. Nothing at first. Just normal, everyday footage of us moving through the house. But then I noticed something. A gap. There were missing hours, footage that had been erased. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. Why would anyone delete security footage? Who even knew how to access it? A cold realization crept up my spine. Emily did, and so did my father. The weight of what I had just uncovered sat heavy in my chest. I didn't have proof yet, not solid proof, but the pieces were starting to come together in a way that I couldn't ignore. The secrecy, the absences, the missing footage. Something was happening right under my nose, and I needed to find out what it was. I told myself that I was being irrational, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. But I also knew that I couldn't trust my own instincts anymore. Something was about to shatter, and I had no idea just how devastating the truth would be. The missing footage gnawed at me, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest every time I thought about it. It was deliberate, precise, and intentional. Someone had erased those hours, and that meant they had something to hide. My mind raced through possibilities, desperately clinging to rational explanations that didn't involve betrayal. Perhaps it was a system glitch, a technical error that conveniently wiped only a few specific recordings. Perhaps Emily had accidentally deleted it, fumbling through the app without realizing what she had done. Perhaps I was losing my mind, becoming the kind of paranoid husband who saw ghosts in every shadow. But deep inside, I knew the truth. I could feel it creeping in, poisoning every thought, turning every look and every touch from Emily into something false, something stained. I became obsessed with patterns, tracking every inconsistency in Emily's behavior and comparing it against my father's schedule. Emily had become more meticulous about her absences, carefully choosing her words, controlling her expressions whenever I asked where she had been. My father, once a man who commanded every conversation with an air of dominance, had grown distant. He canceled our lunches, cut our phone calls short, and seemed to avoid meeting my eyes when we were in the same room. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming an image so vile that my mind refused to fully process it. But I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. That night, when Emily claimed she was meeting a friend for dinner, I waited exactly 15 minutes before grabbing my car keys and following her. My pulse pounded against my skull as I kept my distance, every fiber of my being hoping I was wrong, that this was all in my head, that my paranoia had gotten the best of me. But when I saw her turn onto my father's street instead of heading downtown, my stomach dropped. She pulled into his driveway, sitting in her car for a long moment, checking her reflection, adjusting her dress, running her fingers through her hair. She wasn't meeting a friend. She wasn't even hesitating. There was no nervous energy, no guilt-ridden hesitance. This was routine. The front door opened, and my father stood there, casually dressed, a drink in his hand, waiting for her. The way he looked at her, the way she smiled back at him, the way she stepped inside without a second thought, it all shattered something inside me. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, my knuckles bone-white, my breath shallow as rage and devastation twisted into something unrecognizable. For over an hour, I sat there, unmoving, my world crumbling before me. I couldn't storm in. I couldn't confront them now. If I did, they would deny it, manipulate the situation, twist reality into something that fit their narrative. I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof. Because deep down, I already knew. I just had to see it for myself. The night I saw Emily walk into my father's house, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just anger or heartbreak. It was a deeper, colder realization that the life I had built was a lie. The woman I loved, the man I respected, the very foundation of my world had been crumbling beneath me, and I had been too blind to see it. I spent the entire night awake, sitting in the darkness of our bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every sign I had ignored, every excuse I had accepted. The puzzle was complete now, and there was no more denying the truth. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof, something undeniable, something they couldn't manipulate or talk their way out of. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had changed. I kissed Emily on the cheek before leaving for work, even as my skin crawled at the contact. I called my father, pretending to need his advice about an investment, forcing myself to sound normal. I moved through the motions of my life like a ghost, detached from the reality I once believed in. But beneath the surface, I was making preparations. That afternoon, I purchased additional security cameras, hidden ones, small enough to be tucked away where no one would notice. I installed them in the living room, the hallway leading to our bedroom, and most importantly, inside our bedroom itself. It made me sick to think that I had to do this in my own home, but I needed the truth, and I needed it recorded. For days, I watched and waited, pretending to be the oblivious husband while Emily carried on as if nothing was wrong. She still gave me the same affectionate smiles, still played the role of the devoted wife, but now, I could see it for what it was, deception perfected over time. She didn't hesitate before telling her lies, didn't flinch when I mentioned my father. The ease with which she continued this charade was more painful than the betrayal itself. This wasn't a mistake, a moment of weakness. This was deliberate, planned, rehearsed. Then, it happened. It was a Friday night. Emily had told me she was feeling tired and wanted to stay in while I went out with a few colleagues for drinks. I agreed without hesitation, even acting disappointed that she wouldn't be joining me. But I never left. Instead, I parked my car a few streets away and watched the live feed from my phone. It didn't take long. Less than an hour after I was gone, my father walked through the front door of my home, comfortable, familiar, moving like he belonged there. Emily greeted him, her body language unmistakable. This wasn't guilt or secrecy. This was desire, anticipation, routine. They kissed in the hallway, slow and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. My stomach churned with a violent mix of rage and disgust, but I forced myself to keep watching. They moved to the living room, sitting close, whispering, touching. My father's hand rested on her thigh as she leaned into him, her expression one of pure contentment. I knew what was coming next. I could barely breathe as I watched them stand up, heading toward the bedroom. The bed I shared with her, the space that was supposed to be ours alone. I closed the feed. I had seen enough. My body was rigid with fury, my vision blurred by the sheer force of it. But I didn't move, not yet. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, letting the rage settle into something sharper, more controlled. Emily and my father had destroyed my life without a second thought, betrayed me in the most unforgivable way, and they thought they would get away with it. They wouldn't. Not after tonight. The weight of the truth settled in my chest like a lead anchor, dragging me further into a darkness I had never known. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at my phone, the recorded betrayal seared into my mind. I had all the proof I needed. There was no room for denial, no possibility of misinterpretation. Emily and my father had turned my home into their personal sanctuary of deceit, their audacity stretching beyond anything I could have imagined. The sheer ease with which they carried out their affair, the casual intimacy, the complete lack of hesitation. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a single moment of weakness. It was an ongoing, premeditated violation of everything I had ever known. I forced myself to take deep breaths, steadying the raging inferno inside me. Confrontation was inevitable, but I wasn't going to storm in like a man blinded by fury. That would be too easy for them. They would twist it, try to gaslight me, turn my anger into the problem rather than their actions. No, I needed to be calculated, to make sure that when I finally made my move, it would be one they would never recover from. I needed a plan. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed, even though every second in that house made my skin crawl. I watched Emily move around the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she poured coffee, the same way she had done 1,000 times before. It was a chilling sight. How normal she seemed, how unaffected by the night before. Did she think I was a fool? Did she believe I would never suspect a thing? The mere thought of it sickened me, but I forced a smile when she kissed my cheek, pretending not to notice how quickly she checked her phone the moment I turned away. I played my part well. I didn't ask questions, didn't push for details about her previous night. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. She was too comfortable, too secure in the belief that her secret was safe. My father was the same when I saw him later that afternoon. He greeted me with his usual firm handshake, made small talk about business and the stock market, as if nothing had changed. His ability to look me in the eye without a flicker of guilt was nauseating. I had always admired my father's ability to remain composed under pressure. He was a man of power, someone who never lost control, but he had underestimated me. He saw me as his son, the boy who once sought his approval, the man who worked tirelessly to live up to his legacy. What he didn't realize was that I had learned from him. I had absorbed everything he had taught me about patience, about control, about striking when the moment was right. And now, I was going to use those lessons against him. The day passed slowly, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I considered every option, every consequence. I didn't just want them to know that I had discovered their betrayal. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to experience the very same devastation they had inflicted upon me. And I knew exactly how to do it. Revenge wasn't just an option. It was a necessity. And soon, they would both understand what it meant to betray the wrong man. Every moment in that house felt suffocating. The walls, once a symbol of security and love, now felt like a prison of deceit. The very air I breathed carried the scent of betrayal. Emily moved through our home as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't spent the previous night wrapped in my father's arms. The ease with which she maintained her facade filled me with disgust, but I swallowed it down, knowing that my revenge had to be as cold and calculating as their deception. There was no room for blind rage. What I wanted wasn't just an explosion of anger, but a methodical destruction of everything they held dear. Emily had built a life of comfort, one that I had provided for her. She had the luxury of security, stability, a home that required nothing of her but to exist within it. My father, a man of power and influence, had spent years crafting his legacy, his reputation as a pillar of strength. They had both taken those privileges for granted, never considering that they could be taken away just as easily as they were given. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated me. They saw me as the fool, the man oblivious to the truth unfolding right under his nose. That assumption would be their downfall. That evening, as Emily lay beside me in our bed, I felt the weight of her presence like a lead blanket. The same bed where we had once shared whispered dreams and quiet laughter, the same bed where I had held her in moments of love, was now a place of filth. I listened to the rhythm of her breathing, steady, peaceful, unburdened by guilt. She had no idea that the very sheets she slept on were already soaked in the poison of her choices. I turned away from her, staring into the darkness, my mind a storm of strategy and precision. The first step was to ensure my exit was just as flawless as their deception. I contacted my lawyer, laying the groundwork for my divorce in secrecy. The evidence I had gathered, the hidden camera footage, the security logs, the call records, would make this process swift and absolute. Emily would leave with nothing. No settlement, no assets, no security. The prenup we had signed years ago, something she had never paid much attention to, would ensure that. She had built her life on my foundation, and now I would rip it out from under her. The second step was my father. His entire existence revolved around control, about being the man in charge, the one who dictated the terms of every relationship in his life. But he had one weakness, his reputation. His name carried weight, not just within our family, but within the business world. A scandal of this magnitude wouldn't just shake him, it would ruin him. I had to be meticulous in how I played this hand. If I moved too soon, he would find a way to contain the damage. If I waited too long, I would risk them slipping away unscathed. Timing was everything. For the next few days, I allowed them to believe they were still in control. I let Emily continue with her charade, let my father look me in the eyes without fear. They basked in their own arrogance, never once suspecting that their world was about to collapse around them. But the countdown had already begun, and when the time came, I wouldn't just expose them. I would erase them. The days that followed were a test of my patience, but I had never been more focused. Every detail had to be perfect, every move calculated. I wasn't interested in a dramatic confrontation that would allow them to twist the narrative. I wanted something irreversible, something that would strip them of everything they had taken for granted. Emily carried on as if she were still the devoted wife, her deception so seamless that if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I might have still believed in her. My father remained composed, his usual self-assured presence unwavering, blissfully unaware that the very foundation of his carefully constructed life was already cracking beneath his feet. I spent my time quietly putting things into place, gathering the last pieces I needed before everything could come crashing down. My lawyer had already drafted the divorce papers, the evidence making it clear that Emily had no ground to stand on. She wouldn't just lose me. She would lose the home she had become so comfortable in, the financial stability she had taken for granted, the future she had assumed was hers no matter what she did. My father, however, required a more precise kind of destruction. His reputation was everything. The business world thrived on respect, on the illusion of integrity, and once that illusion was shattered, it could never be repaired. I had gathered every incriminating piece of evidence, every detail that, once exposed, would ruin him. Then, I set the final trap. I told Emily I would be away for the weekend, a business retreat out of town, something I knew would tempt her to bring my father into our home once again. I watched as she feigned disappointment, offering a forced pout before telling me to have a good trip. I nodded, kissed her forehead as if I were still the same trusting fool she believed me to be, and walked out the door. But I never left. Instead, I parked down the street, my phone in hand, the hidden cameras ready to capture what I already knew was coming. I didn't have to wait long. Barely an hour had passed before my father arrived, his presence so casual, so assured, that it made my blood boil. They embraced in the entryway, her arms wrapping around him as if he were the man she had vowed her life to. They laughed, whispered, kissed. He touched her in ways I had once believed were meant only for me. Then, just as I had anticipated, they made their way upstairs, to my bedroom, to my bed. I recorded every second. The proof was undeniable now, indisputable. Not just hidden messages or missing security footage. This was tangible, explicit, inescapable. There would be no lies, no manipulations, no excuses that could rewrite what I had captured. The time for deception was over. The next step was simple. I sent the footage to my lawyer. I sent it to business associates, to those within my father's network who valued reputation above all else. I sent it to close family, ensuring that the truth would spread like wildfire before either of them could attempt damage control. By the time they would realize what had happened, their world would already be in flames. And I would be the one watching as it all burned. The weight of anticipation sat heavy in my chest as I watched the footage unfold in real time. Every movement, every touch, every stolen glance between them only fueled the fire burning inside me. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no moment of pause where either of them considered the depth of their betrayal. They moved through my home as if it were theirs alone, as if I were nothing more than a forgotten afterthought. I let the rage settle, let it mold itself into something sharper, something controlled. Tonight wasn't about anger, it was about precision. It was about making them feel the same devastation they had inflicted upon me. Once I had everything I needed, I executed the final steps of my plan. The footage, carefully edited to leave no room for doubt, had already been sent out to those who mattered. My lawyer had copies. My father's closest business associates had received them, along with a short, precise message exposing the truth. I had ensured that key figures within his professional circle would see it before he had any opportunity to suppress the scandal. Emily's social circle, her friends, acquaintances, even her colleagues, had been included as well. This wasn't just about revealing the affair. This was about erasing any avenue they had to manipulate the narrative. By the time they emerged from my bedroom, still wrapped in the afterglow of their deception, the damage had already begun to spread. I watched as Emily checked her phone, her expression shifting from relaxed satisfaction to confusion, then to something closer to panic. A moment later, my father's phone buzzed, and I saw the exact second realization struck him. He froze, his face draining of color, his hands tightening around the device as he read the messages flooding in. The room around them became suffocatingly still. They knew. I gave them exactly 2 minutes before I walked through the front door. The sound of it closing behind me sent a jolt of shock through them both. Emily spun around first, her eyes widening in horror, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. My father turned next, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had built his life on control, on always being one step ahead, and now, for the first time, he was the one who had been blindsided. I let the silence hang between us, let them absorb the full weight of their downfall before I spoke. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to demand answers. I simply placed my phone on the table, pressing play on the very footage they had unknowingly provided me. The sound of their betrayal filled the room, raw and undeniable. Emily let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth as if she could somehow erase what had already been exposed. My father, ever the composed strategist, clenched his jaw, his fists tightening as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. I had nothing left to say to them. My revenge had already been set in motion, unfolding across every aspect of their lives, dismantling the illusions they had so carefully built. I turned on my heel, walking past them without another glance. Emily reached for me, desperation in her touch, but I pulled away as if her very presence repulsed me. My father didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew there was no justification that could ever undo what he had done. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me, sharp and bracing. But for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. The burden of their deception was no longer mine to carry. The destruction I had unleashed was still unraveling, and by the time the dust settled, neither of them would have anything left. But I wasn't finished yet. Because if Emily could betray me so easily, then so could I. And I knew exactly how to do it. The weight of my revenge was satisfying, but it wasn't complete. Exposing them was only part of what they deserved. My father had spent his entire life controlling people, manipulating situations to suit his needs, believing himself untouchable. Emily had enjoyed the luxury of my devotion, living in a world where she could betray me and never face the consequences. They had both taken from me, stripped me of dignity, trust, and love. But now, it was my turn. I had already shattered their lives. Now, I would make Emily feel the same personal sting of betrayal that she had inflicted upon me. I was never the kind of man to seek out meaningless affairs. I had always believed in loyalty, in commitment, in the sacredness of marriage. But Emily had burned those values to the ground. If she had wanted to keep our marriage intact, she wouldn't have turned to my father. If she had truly loved me, she wouldn't have desecrated the vows we took. So why should I be the only one to suffer? Why should she get to be the only one who indulged in selfish pleasure while I sat in the ashes of what she had destroyed? If Emily thought she could replace me so easily, I would show her just how disposable she was. I knew exactly who to turn to. It wasn't about love, and it certainly wasn't about finding comfort. It was about making Emily feel every ounce of humiliation she had forced upon me. So, I chose someone she would never recover from, her closest friend, someone she confided in, someone who had always been a little too flirty with me when Emily wasn't looking. It wasn't hard. People love a good scandal, and when news of my father and Emily's affair spread, sympathy for me ran high. A single message was all it took. She was eager, more than willing, and I didn't even have to play the grieving husband role. She wanted me, and I wanted to destroy Emily. That night, I brought her home. The same home where Emily and my father had desecrated everything we had built. I made sure every moment of it was captured, every sound, every whisper, every touch, just as I had recorded Emily's betrayal. I wanted evidence, not just for myself, but for the final moment when I would drive the last nail into her coffin. The next morning, I sent the footage to Emily. No words, no explanation, just a video that spoke louder than anything I could have said. Within minutes, my phone exploded with calls, messages, frantic attempts to reach me. I didn't bother reading them. I didn't care. She deserved this. She deserved to know that she had been replaced just as effortlessly as she had replaced me. By the afternoon, Emily showed up at the house, her face pale, her eyes wild with betrayal and fury. I watched her crumble, watched as she tried to understand how the man she had spent years lying to, manipulating, and betraying had turned the tables so effortlessly. She screamed. She cried. She begged. She wanted to know how I could do this to her. The irony was delicious. She had never once considered my pain, never once thought of the consequences of her actions. And yet here she was, shattered, furious, unraveling in real time. I stood there, cold, unfeeling, watching as the reality set in. She wasn't angry because she had lost me. She was angry because I had won. I had taken back control. I had ensured that she wouldn't just lose me, but that she would live with the same wound she had inflicted upon me. But unlike her, I had no regrets. There was no guilt, no hesitation, no second-guessing. Emily had shown me exactly who she was, and I had responded in kind. I let her scream. I let her break. And when she finally fell silent, when the last of her fight had drained from her body, I simply handed her the divorce papers. It was over. And this time, I was the one walking away. The house, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt like a hollow monument to everything that had been destroyed. The echoes of Emily's screams from the day before still lingered in the air, but they no longer affected me. She had cried, begged, lashed out in fury, but it was all meaningless. There was nothing left for her to hold on to. The reality of her loss had settled in, and for the first time, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. But I didn't care. She had made her choice, and now she would live with it. Emily had always been good at controlling situations, at twisting narratives to her advantage, but this time, there was no escape. The footage of her and my father had made its way through every corner of our social and professional circles. People she once considered friends now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal she had created. My father, the man who had built his reputation on power and control, had become a walking disgrace. His name, once respected in the business world, had become synonymous with shame and betrayal. His colleagues no longer answered his calls. His business partners, wary of the scandal, began pulling away. The damage to his career was irreversible, and for the first time in his life, he was powerless. But Emily had suffered the worst of it. The woman who once held herself with effortless confidence was now a shell of who she used to be. Her friends had abandoned her, disgusted by the affair, by the way she had destroyed her own marriage with reckless arrogance. Even her own family, struggling to process the depth of her betrayal, kept their distance. And the most poetic part of it all? My father didn't want her anymore. Their little fantasy had been fun when it was a secret, when it was something forbidden and thrilling. But now, with the weight of real consequences crushing them both, the illusion had shattered. He had no interest in playing the role of a disgraced man who had thrown away everything for his son's wife. He distanced himself from her just as quickly as everyone else had. She had given up everything: our marriage, our home, her dignity, for a man who had never intended to keep her. She tried, in the days that followed, to reach me, to get me to speak to her. First, it was through messages and calls, long-winded apologies, attempts to explain, to justify, to make me see her side. I ignored them all. Then, she started showing up at the house, desperate, pleading, promising that we could fix this. But there was nothing left to fix. I had given her the divorce papers. She knew there was no coming back. The last time she came to the house, she was a mess. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice shaky as she asked me one last time if I could ever forgive her. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt nothing. No love, no anger, no regret. Just indifference. She wasn't the woman I had married. She wasn't the person I had once loved. That woman had died the moment she decided to betray me. Without a word, I closed the door in her face. My father was no different. He had tried to reach out once, under the guise of an apology, but I knew better. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry for the consequences. He was a man who had spent his entire life untouchable, never facing real repercussions for his actions. But this time, he had lost. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the son who had spent his whole life trying to live up to his expectations. And now, he was paying the price. With my revenge complete, with their lives in ruins, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The past was dead, and I had made sure of it. But the future? That was entirely mine to build. The house was empty now, stripped of the weight of betrayal, of memories that no longer belonged to me. I walked through the rooms, each one a hollow shell of what my life had once been. The bed where Emily and I had once laid together was gone, replaced by nothing but a bare mattress I planned to throw out. The dining table where we had shared meals, where we had once planned for a future that never existed, had been sold. I had erased every trace of her, of my father, of the life I thought I had been living. Emily had finally accepted that there was no coming back. After weeks of pleading, of trying to reach me, she had signed the divorce papers. She had no choice. Her reputation was ruined, her life in pieces. The settlement she had expected never came. The prenup had ensured that she walked away with nothing. No home, no financial support, no comfort. She had thrown away stability for a fleeting fantasy, and now she was left with the cold, hard truth of her own actions. My father had faded into obscurity, his name dragged through the mud, his business in ruins. The men who once respected him now saw him as weak, as reckless, as someone who had lost everything for a woman who was never meant to be his. He had stopped reaching out, and I knew it was because he had nothing left to say. There was no redemption for him, no way to rebuild the empire he had so carefully crafted. The only legacy he had left was the destruction he had brought upon himself. For the first time in my life, I felt untethered. I had spent so many years living for others, working tirelessly to be the perfect husband, the perfect son, the perfect man. But now, with all of that gone, I was free. I could go anywhere, do anything. There was no script, no expectations, no one to please but myself. I packed my bags, locking the door behind me without a second thought. The house I had once called home was nothing more than a place now, a structure that had served its purpose. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something new, something untouched by the past. As I drove away, the city lights stretched before me, endless, filled with possibilities. The past had burned, and I had watched it crumble to ash. But now, from those ashes, I was ready to rebuild. Not for revenge, not for anyone else, just for me.